I don't say this very often, but 6 is a unit every timekeeper that cares about meta should get a copy of. He's an amazing support that does it all. He covers both buffs and debuffs, and he can also dispel debuff from allies. He's one of the best support to have in any 4-unit fight, and can be used as the 4th unit for any existing 3-unit team. In this video, we will be going over his collection of buffs and debuff mechanic, the basic of his kit, his playstyle for different portrays, and his resonate and Psychubes. We'll also look at character that synergize and not synergize too well with him at the end, but we're not going to go into teams too much as he is almost a universal 4th unit for any team.
The scale of your soul has tilted.
Now, before we even dive into his kit, the first thing you need to know about 6 is how collection of buff and collection of debuff works. Collection of buff includes 20% penetration, 15% incantation might, 15% mental or reality defense, vitalize 1 which is a healing buff that will heal the unit for 10% of their max health, and Ricochet 1 which is a counter that does 30% of caster's attack as Genesis damage. A special note about Vitalize is that while it looks exactly like the cure from Sotheby, it actually is not and will not be procced by her Ice 3 passive or her ultimate. Collection of debuff includes minus 30% critical defense, which is basically increasing their critical damage taken by 30%, minus 20% reality or mental defense, blind which reduces their single target attacks damage bonus by 30%, Miss Aim which reduces their AoE attacks damage bonus by 30%, and Fracture 1 which makes them take 15% of caster's attack as Genesis damage whenever they're attacked. When 6 apply collection of buff or debuffs, it will prioritize the one that are not already applied to the target. It's important to know that the buff of the same type will also be counted in this even if the number is different. For example, if Shaman has already applied the 15% defense down for both mental and reality, then 6 won't be applying defense down when he is applying the collection of debuffs, even though he applied 20% instead of 15%. Now with that out of the way, let's finally look at his kit.
Silence is a virtue.
Similar to 37, 6 uses Eureka as an additional resource, but unlike 37, 6 Eureka max out at 6 instead of 5 with his Insight 1. If there is at least one ally with 4 or more buffs, including counter, 6 will gain 1 Eureka at the end of the turn. And he also gains 16% damage bonus against enemy with debuffs. At Insight 3, he will apply 2 debuffs from collection of debuff to all enemies when he uses his ultimate, and he will apply 1 buff from collection of buff to all allies passively every single turn, both lasting 2 turns. His skill 1 is an AoE debuff skill. The damage to it is quite low, but it can apply 2 random collection of debuff and grant himself 1 to 3 Eureka based on rank. This is the only other built-in way for 6 to gain Eureka outside of his passive. You will most of the time use this for Eureka in his rotation, but it's also good to use this on enemy before they use their burst. If you have units that can already apply some of the debuff onto the enemy, such as Shaman which apply defense down and Tooth Fairy which apply critical defense down, you can almost guarantee 6 to apply the debuff that reduce enemy's damage. His skill 2 is a targeted buffing skill. It applies 2 collection of buff regardless of its rank, but will also dispel 2 to 6 debuffs depending on the rank. This is the first skill that can consume Eureka for him. If 6 has at least 5 Eurekas, he will apply Empower Incantation 1 to the target ally. At lower portrait, this is usually what you want to use Eureka for. You will gain quite a bit of extra damage when your DPS skill gets ranked up. Now his ultimate is quite crazy. At base, it already does 700% damage, but at 6 Eureka, he can deal up to 1000 damage against enemy based on how many type of debuff they have. At lower portrait, I do not suggest you to use Eureka on the skill. 6 Eurekas is quite difficult to get, as once you are at 4 Eurekas, you can no longer gain more from his S1. So unless you plan out a rank 3 debuff card, or you wait for 2 turns without using his buff card and let it charge passively, you won't be able to get the actual 300 multiplier. Which is not really worth it anyway, considering Empower Incantation is cheaper and better on the DPS.
The balance needs to be restored.
As a buffer, he is perfectly fine at P0. One of the more important things when using him is to keep the passive Eureka generation on. So, for most part, you want to use his buffing skill every other turn, which, on top of his passively applied buff, will maintain at least 4 buff on the target. Depending on whether your main target has a buff themselves like Tooth Fairy's Baby Tooth, you sometimes would want to hold the buff skill for the second turn, since if the target only has 1 buff and 6 at 2 with his buffing skill, it won't actually trigger the Eureka generation for the turn, thus reducing the Eureka of the rotation by 1. Now this changed a bit at P2. With P1, he now only needs 5 Eureka to trigger the bonus of his ultimate, with its damage cap increased to 1100, and his P2 increases the passive Eureka generation from 1 to 2. It also raises his damage bonus against target with more than 4 debuff from 16% to 24%. So at P2, not only does 6 have more value from his ultimate, he also has enough Eureka for 1 buffing skill and 1 ultimate every rotation. His Portrait 4 and 5 make his ultimate even stronger. At P5, he only needs 4 Eureka to deal up to 1450% mental damage to the target. Because his ultimate bonus damage cap out at 6 stack instead of 4 debuffs, you now need to make sure enemy has at least 4 different debuffs to take the full damage from the ultimate. His P5 ultimate at max potential is the single highest damage skill this game has. Because of that, you would completely change the playstyle of him at P5. You now want to use him as the main carry, and look to use his skill and fuse as often as possible to generate the maximum amount of Moxies.
The moment of utterance.
For his resonance, there are in general 2 sets. There is the crit set. This set gives the highest damage potential. You will most likely to be using 6 with Tooth Fairy, so landing a critical hit shouldn't be an issue. The other set is the attack set. Now, while this is the attacking set per se, it actually provides a decent amount of survivability. So if you're struggling to survive with the crit set, you can use this one. For Psychube, Balance Please, which released with him, is the best in slot. With 380 attack, ultimate damage, and damage bonus, as long as there is no element counter between him and the target, this is absolutely the best to use it. However, when you are fighting against enemy with Spirit Element, which disable the passive of the Psychube, you want to instead use Lecturer's Leisure, which will be available in shop permanently after patch 1.4. 6 can be used in pretty much every 4-unit team, but there are some particular units that synergize with him especially well. An Unleashed Insight and her ultimate give her incantation level up passively. When combined with 6, she can rank up even more skill and more often, greatly increasing the amount of rank 2 and rank 3 cards you will be able to use. Tooth Fairy and Shaman covers some of the debuffs from his collection of debuffs, which will reduce the amount of RNG from it. But the debuff from Tooth Fairy and Shaman has slightly lower numbers, so keep that in mind. Some characters have their own special buff. One example is Tooth Fairy, who has a special Baby Tooth buff. This counts towards 6 passive, so if you don't mind throwing buff at them, you can start 6 rotation 1 turn early and begin generating Eureka. Jiu Niangzi, which come at 1.6, synergizes extremely well with 6, as Jiu Niangzi have self-perpetuating buff from her own passive, which allows 6 to passively generate Eureka. On top of that, Jiu Niangzi also wants the buff from 6 to increase the amount of liquor she can passively generate per turn, increasing her damage output. The one character that does not synergize well with 6 is actually 37. While 6 is very versatile, the majority of his buff and debuff cannot affect the Genesis damage output of 37, and Genesis damage is the most important part of the kit, especially against Raid, where you will pretty much be doing only 30% of your normal damage at final health bar. The only debuff that will directly affect her Genesis output is the 40% critical defense down, but since you will be using Tooth Fairy in the team, it won't be applied to the enemy. And that's pretty much everything to know about 6. He's a very versatile support that can be used in most places, but he is especially good in Raid, and will make reaching SSS much easier. So I highly recommend everyone to get at least 1 copy of him. This has been SteamBunX, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.